Dear ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Mathias Corvinus Collegium, I'm so pleased to welcome you on the 4th MCC Budapest Lectures. This time we will focus on globalism, and I will be the moderator of tonight's discussion. I'm Fanni, Surjányi, Head of Research at MCC. First, we will have a discussion, and then we will open the floor for audience questions. Please be engaged into the discussion because we would like to have a very vivid debate tonight. And if you post on social media, please use hashtag MCC Budapest Lectures. Should you be in need of that, you can find interpreter devices at the entrance. Please return them at the end. The panelists are not only remarkable speakers and internationally renowned speakers, but also good friends of ours. I would like to introduce you Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, who is a columnist for Daily and Sunday Telegraph, contributor to BBC and the New York Post, distinguished senior fellow at the Gatestone Institute. Please give her a warm welcome. Werner Patzelt is a German political scientist and professor of comparative political science. Please welcome him too. And John O'Sullivan, who is political commentator and journalist, president of the Danube Institute, senior fellow at the National Review Institute, and former advisor to Margaret Thatcher. Please welcome him. Let's move on to the discussion itself, because we have quite a topical topic tonight, which is globalism. We should probably start with making a distinction between globalism and globalization, because many tend to confuse these. It's an old new term, both of them, and it's worth to shed some light, both on the difference and on the real meaning. So please, help us.
Am I on first? Oh, I say, okay. I thought I was on third. I was relaxed. Well, I take it that first of all, globalization means many different things given the context. And the topic globalization nationalism as two topics also brings in, for example, populism. But it brings in identity politics. All of these are difficult and hot-button issues at the moment and attracting a lot of attention. And furthermore, the meaning of these words is, not only are they various, but they rapidly change. For example, identity politics, if we had been discussing this 20 years ago, we'd be talking about such questions as whether or not the European Union was a threat to the national identities of France and Germany and Britain and so on. And to some extent, that argument is still around because of Brexit, where the view of the majority of Brits, as it turned out, was that it was. On the other hand, it's now mutated to the much odder, really, and curious and unsettling politics in which people question whether or not there are such identities as sexual identities, and if so, are there two or more? It's hard to maintain there are more than two sexual identities in a way, but because sexual is about biological facts. So that has further developed into whether or not there are such things as gender identities and how important they are. And I don't think, for example, if a politician were resurrected from the 1990s and presented with some of the arguments over gender identity politics, I don't think they would understand at all what had happened. They'd be amazed at the kind of spread of nescience and skepticism to these different areas. Now, I'm going to begin with I've got a quote from Margaret Thatcher here, my old boss, who said in a talk on nationalism and globalism herself, she said, "Nationalism is always a bit uncomfortable for other nations, neighbours. It can be abused like other powerful political emotions. But national pride offers people a genuine identity in a world of cardboard cutouts. It offers an anchor against the pull of bureaucratic internationalism, against that cultural globalization which conservatives rightly fear as opposed to economic globalization, which, in my view, we should not. We conservatives must applaud attachments to the values and institutions which unite us, and that means we should promote a sense of national identity. So the first point, of course, is do we accept that distinction, and do we think it a worthwhile one? Well, I do. As I look upon economic globalization, it seems to me that it is, as far as possible, a set of arrangements agreed between different nations or between different groups of nations on reducing trade barriers and barriers to trade and investment, so that the investment can find its way to its most profitable and useful outcomes, and that, it seems to me, has been, on balance, an enormous advantage for the human race. I think it's reasonable for us to say that about 3 million people in Asia, mainly, but by no means entirely Chinese, but 3 billion people in Asia have been lifted out of grinding savage poverty and brought into the world labor market and into the possibility of a middle-class life by Western standards. Do I think that a good thing? Yes, I think, of course, it is. Does it? It's difficult to think of a political policy of any kind which has produced a much better life for 3 billion people, and that has to weigh heavily on the scales. The second element we have to say is, of course, that there are inevitably, in my view, not that many, but there are inevitably some people who lose out in this. In other words, investment that in the world of trade and investment barriers, investment which might have gone to Western Europe or to the United States, probably from those countries as well as into them, so to speak, would have meant a higher standard of living for Western European and American workers. Not by any means for all of them, because, of course, they have had in these years a higher standard of living, in part because of globalization. Why do I say that? Well, I once actually had a conversation with Milton Friedman, and I said, "Look, Milton, I'm a great admirer of you, but I'm a bit puzzled here. It looks to me as though the money supply has been out of control for some time, and yet we haven't had that burst of inflation which I would expect." And he said, "John, have you ever looked at the New York rental market? Have you ever tried to buy any old masters?" Answer, by the way, no. Have you ever tried to go buy into the positional goods that the very rich want to have because they can afford them and nobody else can? And he said, of course, there has been inflation, but it's gone into those kind of goods. Why? I'm the straight man in this story. "I don't know," I said. "Why?" And he said, "Well, at the same time as the money supply has been rocketing ahead without inflation, goods have been coming onto the international market from Asia and the rest of the world that have essentially, A, prevented inflation, and B, provided goods across a wide range of, from everything, really, as my wife, who dislikes the Walmart, complains about all the time. You can buy virtually everything made in China, and that has held down the rate of inflation, and it's reduced the cost of living in real terms for American workers of all kinds. Have some people lost out? Well, some of the American workers have, because they've been in industries which have been hard hit by competition. And to some extent, and here is where I think Donald Trump does have a point, some of the trade agreements have been structured in such a way, or have been exploited cleverly in such a way, that they've hit certain parts of the American workforce more than others. And secondly, and that has produced the people we call the losers in Britain, the losers in Western Europe, the losers presumably here. Actually, you've done very well in recent years, because a lot of investment has come into this country because those trade barriers have been removed. And when you haven't done well, people have been able to emigrate. They've been able to export themselves to Western Europe, where they've been able to get good jobs. And by the way, There's a lot of controversy about immigration, but there's very little controversy about Hungarian immigration. But Hungarians make very good migrants because they adapt very quickly to their society, and they're highly educated too. In the main, you've had, by comparison with other countries, high educational standards. So those are the good things. Now, what are the bad things? Well, I think that brings us into another question, and that is that the political globalization. Now, in Europe, that political globalization tends to be seen in the European idea, and I suspect I'll differ with virtually everybody in the room on this one. But the European idea is that we should transfer, we should create a trading area which is also a political union. Now, I was in favor of the European, well, it used to be the European Economic Community, when it was a free trade area. And although I had my doubts about it in lots of ways, nonetheless, I believed that a system in which goods can travel back and forth, and the best and the competition would reduce prices, and it would produce a better life for people. And that I think is broadly correct. There are two steps on from that, however, and I'm counting this under cultural and political globalization, which I think are highly questionable. The first is that when you move from a free trade area, which essentially just says you can transport goods freely across boundaries, to a situation in which you have what's called a single market from 86 onwards, that in effect replaces a regime of what was called mutual recognition of standards to one of bureaucratic harmonization. So essentially, if you were in the European community, as it was, if you were in that and you exported your goods, people would say, well, we know the Brits basically have got fairly good standards. We know that their regulations are more or less ours. So we accept their statement that this has been properly regulated and has met high standards. And the same was true for the Germans and the French and everybody else. Maastricht meant that regime was replaced by a series of committees in Brussels, which hammered together existing regulations into a single regulation, and then, of course, goods flowed freely on that basis. I'm against that. I'm against it because it tends to be gold-plated by the bureaucrats, it tends to be over-influenced by corporations in Brussels, and corporations are represented in Brussels in a way that small business competitors are not. That tended, therefore, to produce regulations that favored big business rather than small or medium business. And there are a whole series of objections. It also took the regulations out of national democratic debate and put them into supranational bureaucratic debate. I didn't like that. And the second, of course, is the movements later towards creating what is a political union with more and more powers going upwards and very few, in fact none, coming back. So I don't like that, and I don't think it's a good idea. I think it reduces democratic accountability, and I think it's one of the reasons why the British, even though they got some opt-outs from this, it's one of the reasons why the British left, and it's one of the reasons why other countries are nervous and worried. I mean, there is now populism, as it's called, is the resentment of democratic electorates which find that an increasing number of political disputes are taken out of their hands and out of the hands of their own democratically elected parliaments and decided by bureaucrats and the committees of politicians. But those politicians are more or less bureaucrats when it comes down to it in a remote capital. And I think for all kinds of reasons, that's a bad idea. And one of this is my final point, because you've got to stop me if I'm going on too long. I can ramble on endlessly. The final point I'd make is this. Just lately we've heard the argument from a French finance minister, from a Dutch liberal leading politician, Verhofstadt, from the influential economist, Charlemagne correspondent, the idea that Europe should become an empire. And what is an empire? In the debate that we're having, and this debate has been heavily influenced by the, I think, very interesting and actually impressive book by Yoram Hazany. That debate is influenced by the following division. Empires, he says, I think he's right, are extensive areas of rule which combine several nations, and in which even when there are, and there are of course in Europe, attempts to create democratic structures to rule them, nonetheless are much less democratic than the structures of national governments. And nations are, well, again, they may consist of several tribes, but they are essentially a people united by language, by culture, by history, and by the experience of living for many years under existing and at the same constitutional structures and with the same historical memories, what Lincoln called the mystic chords of memory. So real debate is possible in Hungary. It's possible in Britain. It's possible in France. But real democratic debate is not really possible in the European Union. Any more than, as Noel Malcolm pointed out, any more than you can say Europe is united by a set of overriding interests, because the concept of overriding Finno-Portuguese interests just really doesn't make any kind of sense. So I want to move away from, I personally would be, I want Brexit to work, I want it to stay out. But whether or not we're in or out, I wish Europe well. But I think the satisfaction of those well wishes depends upon the decentralization of power in Europe to make Europe more democratically accountable, and if a little slower to reach decisions, nonetheless more likely to make wise decisions rooted in popular consent. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for bringing up Yoram Hazany's book, because I wrote his definition of globalism. He just said it's the version of old imperialism. What do you think about that? And also, how would you define globalism and globalization?
Well, I think I've said my bit.
I would be very chary of giving a single definition of globalization, because as we were talking about this among ourselves, we all discovered that when we were preparing for this talk, there was not one subject, but lots of different subjects. And because I'm a journalist and not a political scientist, I thought, what comes out of globalization when everything's said and done, and how does globalization impinge on the general consciousness? And of course, in recent years, the effects of globalization, such as they have been described, has been the rise of populism, quote unquote. That's when people said suddenly, but there are people who protest globalization. Globalization was supposed to be very good for all of us, and I totally agree with John that it has been good for many of us. So when does it stop being good for us? And it's when the segments of the population feel that they have been forgotten, that they have been overlooked, and more than that, that they are being despised. There's a very seminal book, in addition to Yoram Hazany's book, I think, to today's debate, and that is The Road to Somewhere by David Goodhart. I don't know whether many of you have read this, but I really recommend it. It's essentially making the case that in Britain, but that applies in most of the nations where you have, quote unquote, again, anti-globalization movement, you can divide the population into two segments unequal in size, and one is about 1/4, 20%, who are well educated, they can work anywhere, they feel more close to people who have the same kind of good jobs, whether it's in media or in industry or in communications, in services, in banking, in finance. These are people who have a set of skills, and those sets of skills enable them to work in any other capital. They feel closer. You have a doctor or a journalist or an author, and they feel closer to people like them than in Spain, for instance. If you take the British, they will feel closer to people like them somewhere else. Their relations are not bound by place. Their relations are bound by the capacity to communicate and bound by common interests. So they make their own little sort of fatherland, so to speak. And these are people who voted against Brexit, of course, because they wanted to remain, because they felt closer to the elites in other country. And these are people who have not lost out. And then you've got a majority of people who are more defined by something that's much closer to them, which is they live and they live in the same area more or less all their lives. They still identify with this area when they go to live somewhere else. They have family and close friends very locally. And they have a sense of belonging to one nation that is a tradition and a continuity that's lasted longer than themselves. They do not make their own future. They do not make their own future, but they belong to their own past. And they've been opposed, but it's very obvious that the ones who say, let's go forward, let's do like the Americans for something, let's do like the French for something else, they're not talking a national language anymore. They're talking the language of a supernation that they found in themselves. The somewheres, the people who still have a sense of place and a sense of belonging, are the ones who voted against Brexit, for Brexit in Britain. They're the ones who voted, the deplorables who voted for Trump in America, because they felt that people on both coasts of America were not representing them anymore. And in France, there are the yellow vests who have demonstrated against the ultimate anywhere in some vision, who is Emmanuel Macron. And there are people who voted for Salvini, and here I suspect there are people who voted for Viktor Orban, precisely with the same reasons. But that is, to some extent, that is the consequence of a long process. And the long process is how do we do not sort of bear globalization as one single amorphous and irresistible process, and how do we modulate it, how do we control it, without turning ourselves into, for instance, in the worst examples, Albania under Enver Hoxha, or the German Democratic Republic under Honecker, or Romania under Ceausescu. We know perfectly well that a country that closes its borders, that decides that it's going to do its own thing, gets impoverished. And it's more a question that how do we balance this? And how, as I was reading this, the various sort of strains that make up this conversation, a conversation about culture, a conversation about trade, a conversation about economics, a conversation about politics, I came to the conclusion that, unfortunately, there are no straight diagnoses and there are no straight solutions. So it's more a question that fine-tuning the regulation with an eye to keeping our minds open. And if you think, well, that's going to be difficult, to a large extent, what's bad about globalization, I think it's born out of laziness. The standardization is born out of laziness. And the capacity which we ought to have nowadays with the use of big data, with the use of very fine analysis of what people's choices, we ought to be able to be at least as good as Amazon to offer us different goods and ways of receiving those goods. We ought to be able to apply this to the game of politics and to the game of economics to try and have control over the monitoring of the effects, the political effects, in a fine way, and then find possibilities to halt the effect of globalization by a finite period of protectionism that has clear political aims, clear economic ends, and cannot be renewed indefinitely, because otherwise you become both lazy, i.e. you do not have to take difficult decisions, protected by the measures that prevent other goods or other policies to come to you, but you can't stay. If you stay on for too long, you just think, well, I will postpone this. And France is a very good example. We are one of the big sort of movers of the European Union. We see, unlike the British, we see absolutely no reason to get out of the European Union, because when we don't like a policy by the European Union, we do not apply it. We sign to treaties and we do not apply it. Having said all sorts of things about migrations, for instance, in effect closed the Italian border. We had lots of many spot customs checks, suddenly. And then we used a disposition of European rules whereby for 28 days you could have controls, again, checks and controls at the border, and we renewed the period a large number of times. And it's been effective. And it's very difficult, if you take another rule, which is that the country's debt cannot be more than 3% of GDP, for instance. I think we've reached this halcyon state of economic affairs twice in 30 years, whereas other countries like Italy have a debt that's below the required level, but they're told that they have to put their house in order now. This is something that exists, and you can be generous and say, well, this is the application of fuzzy logic to politics and economics. But at the same time, it has made us lazy. We have protected our economy. It's been a long time coming. I remember something that was called the Plan 3T, the 3T plan, and it was for 3 providers of electronics in the 80s, and the idea that the government would help these people to create a kind of let's not call it a cartel, but it was a cartel, and they would fight the Japanese invasion of Europe. And they thought the easiest way to do this was to have a special video recording format, which was not Betamax and which was not VHS. It was supposed to be V2000, and we failed dismally. Nobody wanted to buy it, even though the French border was it was not exactly closed to Japanese VCRs. Japanese VCRs had to go and clear customs in a provincial town in France called Poitiers, which didn't have the equipment to unload containers. That had to be done by hand, and therefore it added quite a lot of cost to those VCRs, to the point where the price in the shops was the same as the French-produced VCRs. The French became lazy over that. The V2000 standard did not sell, and in the end it failed. The ultimate protected economy produces a Trabant, and I don't think any of you, unless they are really collectors of weird things, own a Trabant today. So this applies to politics as well. And I would say that it's difficult, it's granular, and the main point to not be globalized is to realize that you've got, in the end, the trend is something that you've got to accommodate so that you get to a position of strength in which you can go back and swim in the ocean like everybody else. It's not a simple solution. I will say a last thing, which is every time I come to Budapest, I fall in love with the city again because it's extraordinarily beautiful. And what's fascinating about Hungary is it's a country that's got a very strong personality. You've got a strong language. It's very different from all other European languages. You've got a national character. You've got sometimes unhappy history, but certainly a sort of a history of great resistance and fighting. And you've got a national cohesion that is difficult to best, I think, possibly in Japan, but Japan is an island. It's a lot easier than when you have borders all over the place. And at the same time, I'm a French woman. I was born in Paris, and when I look at your monuments, when I listen to your musicians, and I have done this a long time in my life before I came, past and present musicians, when I read your literature, when I look at the corpus of museums that you have here in Budapest, this to me is something that's familiar, it is European, it is recognizably European. So your personality does not detract from your European character. Your personality gives a sort of specific iteration of the European general character. It is, it only belongs to this continent. I think you can be integrated in Europe, and I think you can be different, and I suspect that in the world, globalization need not erase our personality.
Well, more often than not, I'm inclined to describe complex things in simple, sometimes even simplistic terms. So let it be here. The initial question was about the difference between globalization and globalism. My simple answer is, globalization is a process driven by objective forces like technological development, development of communicative devices, development of the goods to be transported, and so on, and driven by power structures which are shifting throughout history. Whereas, and the world, as has been told before, quite correctly, has benefited very much from globalization. Not only we in the rich part of the world, but the global south as well. Globalism is an ideology, a highly detrimental ideology. And this becomes clear if you, or as soon as you take a closer look at globalization. The first thing that should strike you is that globalization, note, I'm talking about globalization right now, not about globalism, I come later to that. The globalization is not really a phenomenon of the last decades. The last important phase of globalization was the era of colonialism and imperialism. The difference is, however, from a European or a Western perspective, that at that time, we, the Western world, were at the top of the pecking order. Whereas in this new era of globalization, with the rising power and rising influence of China, we are no longer at the top of the international pecking order, and we feel that. And we feel that. See, the globalism from the era when we, Europeans, and the people from the Western world were at the top of the pecking order, the ideology of globalism is what we called make the world safe for democracy, Westernization, universalism of our Western values. This is a form of globalism. And it creates a lot of problems, in particular in our relationships with China. Because the Chinese, due to their own important and great history, do not think that the world had to wait for Western dominance before it got cultivated and transformed, at least partially, into a better place than in other periods of time. So, globalization is no new phenomenon. Change has our role in the process of globalization, and therefore the way in which we reflect what's going on. Globalism today is no longer underlining the importance of the West and the Western values. They are without any alternative in the world. The world needs to be westernized, such that it can become a better place, finally. No, it's different today. The important thing I want to stress is, secondly, that the core issue of this process of globalization and the challenge for the intellectual movement that I defined as globalism, the core challenge is the role of the state. To be more precise, the role of the nation state, which was defined by German doctrine of the state as the holy trinity of an area, of a people, and of legitimate authority exerted on this area over a certain population on this area. This nation state, with a population which knew to be a population of a given state, which got an awareness of its particularities, living under a common constitution, sharing historical memories, this state is the only framework in which we know to design, at least so far, democracy. Outside the framework of the nation state, we do not know how to organize democracy. The European Union, with all the benefits it has brought to us, maybe not to the French, maybe to the British, certainly to the French, because they tried to get rid of European law whenever it does not fit into their framework. Whatever the European Union has brought to us, we have not been able to organize democracy. There is nothing like a European demos, a people, we the people of Europe. There is nothing like that. There is a secondary identity as a European, of course. We as Germans, you as Hungarians, French, and so on, we all are Europeans. We know it. Whenever we come back to Europe from Asia, we feel that we are at home here, and then we go to our particular homes in England, in France, in Germany, in Hungary, wherever. So there is no demos, no people. There is no common language. Therefore, exactly that medium in which democratic policy making can be done, democratic discourse can be done, we do not share that. There is no European public, there are no European newspapers, no European television. And of course, the whole framework of policy making is not democratic in the classic sense. We have not the principle of one person, one vote, with equal weight of this vote when we're voting for the European Parliament. and therefore parliamentarization of the European Commission will not end up in democracy, because the whole game is in one way unfair. It is fair in other ways, as a redistributing process of money, as something protecting Germans from being a strong nation and protecting the others from Germany being a strong nation. There are many advantages, but they are not based on democracy. So the nation state is the only framework in which we know how to organize democracy, and therefore it does not come as a big surprise that many movements that we call right-wing, anti-European, populist movements share the idea of democracy. For democracy's sake, they say, there is too much Europe. We need to get rid of Europe, like the Brits who got out of the European Union, like Polish, Hungarian who say, well, there is maybe too much European governance mixing into our domestic affairs. What for are we going to vote when there come European regulations telling us that this or that law doesn't correspond to European rules, to which we have not contributed significantly. The second issue is that the state, the nation state, is the framework in which solidarity can be practiced. Exactly that solidarity which is the very base of the social welfare state. Taking money from one part of the population, giving it to the other part, based on the expectation that the richer are really willing to pay more taxes and to give the poor or the poorer. So outside the nation state, we neither can have democracy nor the advantages of social welfare states. And here, globalization comes again in an era of migration, and there are many good reasons for migration, from climate to civil wars and so on, differences in welfare and so on. In a world full of migration, and with international rules which are in favor of migration, it is hard to maintain the state. It is hard to maintain democracy if people are told, well, whoever wants to settle down in this country should have the right. And of course, after a couple of years, they should vote in local elections, and after some years, they should vote in national elections, after having transformed themselves, these groups of migrants, into ethnic parties. And it's hard to maintain a social welfare state if the people have the feeling, well, when we are unemployed, we are reduced to a low level of income, and those migrants who come, well, they start with this low level of income without ever having participated in creating that wealth that now is distributed with the rest of the world. And again, you see why the issue, the intellectual issue, is globalism, a theory, an ideology which says, well, there is no need for nation states. There are historical phenomena coming into being 350 years ago. They will disappear from history. Maybe this is true. But all the advantages of the states, or of the state as a type of political organization, will disappear as well. Those people with this globalist ideology saying, well, we need no states, no borders, no nations, they bring democracy down and the social welfare state down, social justice down, loyalty of people to their government, and they will bring our well-settled European Western world into disarray. So globalization can be good, and on balance has been good. Globalism, under the new circumstances, is a detrimental and highly dangerous ideology. We should not share it.
Do you think that it would be correct to say that today we are witnessing the battle of globalization versus patriotism and probably even imperialism against nationalism?
I try to give a short answer. I think this is to put the things a bit too sharp. See, in the era of globalization, you need patriotism because you need to defend solidarity within the framework of a democratic nation state. So it's important. It's the other side of the medal. Patriotism and globalization go hand in hand if the whole game shall have positive results. Nationalism was that form of love for one's country which seemed to be appropriate when we Europeans were at the top of the pecking order, when loving Britain, ruling the seas. was like bringing civilization to the world. We as French, nous avons une mission civilisatrice, and therefore we need the globalization such that these wild people from the global south finally can join our ranks as a civilized people. So this was nationalism, overestimating the importance, the value of one's own nation. No, that's not necessary, that's detrimental. Patriotism, love for one's country, the being prepared and willing to serve for one's country, this is exactly required in the era of globalization.
Well, I generally agree with what both speakers have said, and I think my brief reference to the difference, well, Margaret Thatcher's distinction between cultural globalization and economic globalization was in fact essentially the same as your globalism versus globalization, and I think that's a good formulation. I want to focus, if I can, on something that Anne-Elisabeth said, and then make a brief point. And it's this. One reason why I think in a European context, preferring a free trade area to a regulated single economy is this. Within a free trade area, which doesn't have this bureaucratic harmonization as its core, you can have jurisdictional competition. And jurisdictional competition in international relations is more or less the equivalent of federalism in a national political context. It distributes power down, and it effectively it effectively means that within a trade area, different models of tax and regulations can be tested against one another. In fact, if you have a free trade area and leave it at that, that free trade area becomes a market for governments. People can move from A country to B country. Investors can switch their investments from A to B in accordance with what they think of as the better trade, the better tax and regulation package. And I think that's a good thing. And I think that effectively some governments will win in that market competition and others will lose. What happens, however, is that governments with high taxes and levels of regulation which investors and people don't like will tend to migrate to other countries. And this will put pressure on governments which are spending too much money, taxing too heavily, to restrain themselves. Governments don't like that. And therefore, one can see Maastricht and other developments in the European Union as being, in effect, an attempt by its governments to move from a market of governments to a cartel of governments. And because they increasingly look upon the amount they cost the taxpayers as their right, and they want to take more and more of it. And they don't want to find themselves in the position, as of course Germany and France do find themselves in, and Britain to an extent as well, competing with Latvia or Estonia or Ireland for businesses to go there, or for highly skilled citizens to move to with who can command high incomes to go there. And I think that's a very important element. It's foreshadowed in Adam Smith, who says that with a system of free importation and exportation, the different countries become like provinces in a vast empire. But that's a vast empire which has no imperial center exercising imperial powers.
Sure. Would you like to add something, Anne-Elisabeth?
Thank you. I was really interested in the difference between globalism and globalization, because you just gave us a hashtag, to live tweet this discussion, and ideology has become a shortcut. Again, this word laziness that sort of came to my mind, it's become a shortcut. This is the solution that will solve everything. Whenever somebody gives you, a solution that is simple and clear to explain, it's usually the wrong solution. Not always, but honestly, statistically, I think it's going to be a strong solution. But the capacity of public opinion to accept this, unfortunately, has become less and less. We have an extremely modern world in which the effects of globalization have accelerated. Circulation is faster, trade is faster, of course circulation of electronic information is incredibly faster, with the result that we feel this is a crisis because it's a real political crisis. And those who say, but we want to defend ourselves, versus the ones who say we want to do good things for you and you are really stupid in not believing us when we do it. It's become this state of affairs in international as well as national politics in which you have, it is impossible to get the other side to agree with you on anything, even things that should be simple to agree on. The demonization of leaders, and your leader has been demonized. Emmanuel Macron, who's got lots of failings, is demonized by the yellow vests. All sorts of things. That is something that has to be resisted from the bottom up, basically. Finding ways of agreement, I think, is the way to actually being able to have policies that will be finer and will not be wholesale as this is evil, we want to fight it, or this is good, we've got to do something. It's find something that you can agree with and work from there, and then try and find bipartisan support to policies, even small policies, because that's the only way I think to get out of it. It's otherwise we say it's a failed. Even the tagline of this conference, it's globalism a failed utopia. I don't think it's a utopia. I think it's a state of affairs, and I don't think as long as we have a planet to live on, I don't think it's failed either. But in terms of trying to sort of build, even into the parties that you represent, the political associations that you belong to, trying to build something that takes into account complexity is really the most important.
Could localism help to have a complex picture instead of having a very simplified and united one? And if so, how would you approach the essence of localism, which is also the cornerstone of the conservative way of thinking, according to Roger Scruton?
I think actually localism, and that against is localism should not look as a threat. You can say, these are things that are not going to work for me, but these are things that exist, it represents you, and I may decide to sort of work with this, but at least you know what you're talking about. If I take a very controversial subject, which is part of globalization, it's the movement of migrations and the fact that the groups of citizens who migrate are, some of them adapt very well. Hungarians is a very good example of people who immigrate anywhere and adapt very well, and you've got groups who adapt less well. And what, for instance, the current government of Great Britain is saying is they want to be able to control immigration with skill sets, with points, with a number of things, and possibly, and the French attitude, which has not been enforced, unfortunately, but which certainly existed under, for instance, Nicolas Sarkozy, which is you have to obtain a commitment to the nation you're coming to. So in two ways, we understand the specificity of the people who come, and we want them to have skills, we want them to have an open mind to a number of things. And as the host country, and the people who are coming have to commit to something that's also specific, which is, these are my values, these are how my values work with this country. In Jewish tradition, I can't possibly, there's somebody who knows more than this about this here, but there's a tradition, there's a prayer that's being said for the king or the state. And there's a saying, I think, in the Talmud that says that the law of the country goes first. If you have a commandment which is not one of the main commandments, and the law is different, then you should follow the law of the country. And that's a basis. But I think we've been shy of saying this because, as we were talking early on, of the mysterious evolution of the view of difference between genders and other things, is we are afraid of being being criticized by saying, this is our country, we want you to respect what goes in our country, we can have a discussion with you, we can have a global discussion, and actually we should have a global discussion and a national discussion so that we know who we are. But we've got to state this this at the outset, and that should be very open. There used to be, when Sarkozy had a Ministry of Immigration, there was a little sort of briefcase in plastic, actually, with a series of documents that people who wanted to have a residence permit for 10 years in France, which is the gateway to French nationality, they signed a contract with the state, and the contract said a number of things, including women have the right to have their own career, women have the right to have their own check, women have the right not to be controlled by the men in their family, and a number of commitments that you had to belonging to French society. Unfortunately has been given up, and the idea was you signed up to this, and if something that obviously was a sort of breach of what we call public order in France, and this was not respected, then people could say, we're not giving you the 10-year, we're not renewing, or we're halting the 10-year residence permit that you received because you have broken the contract with a country that is happy to host you. And this is something that probably should be applied, because then it would be open on both sides. This is what we offer you when you come, and this is what you commit to when you come, and this is the respect as well that we offer. I'm very impressed by the way Germany, for instance, has worked very hard to try and assimilate the migrants. They have dedicated classes, they had all sorts of social structures, they have German courses, and I look at the French way, and the French way to keep migrants away was to make the reputation of those places where migrants congregated, or the few hospitality centers that we had, so nightmarish that the Bush Telegraph, as it's called, would sort of go back to people organizing, especially economic migrations, and say, look, really, you don't want to go to France, it's a horrible place. Why is there this thing called the jungle at Calais? It's because they want to go to Britain, where they know the conditions are going to be better. I don't think it's a terribly civilized way of doing things. It's possibly efficient and cynical, but it's not a terribly civilized way of doing things.
On localism, which I haven't thought a great deal about, but just you provoked one or two ideas. One is that I think that as a social description of how people respond to politics and other things, localism, of course, is an attractive idea. It's attractive because it means that if you know your MP, you're able to see him. If you have a local councillor, you can complain about the fact that your rubbish is never collected, all these things. I think that as a description of how life operates, it's a very sensible one. There are two problems I have with it as an ideology, which is a different matter. I mean, for example, I do not think that we want to have organization or rules which say you've got to source foods locally. Yes, I like locally sourced food, of course, and if a restaurant wants to do it and provide me with that benefit, that's good. On the other hand, an awful lot of the improvements of life are the result of a very efficient retail marketing sector, which means that I can get vegetables that I didn't even know existed when I was about 20. Aubergine, for example, did not exist in Liverpool. And when I came back from university in London to ask my mother to get some to make moussaka, there simply wasn't any. Nobody in Liverpool knew anything about the vegetable. They doubted it existed. So I think that is another element, and I think we don't want that kind of coercive virtue imposed on people by environmental groups. And the other thing is, government has got to be understood by people. We can't endlessly multiply the levels of government. At the moment, what you've got is local government, regional government, in the case of Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, sort of semi-national government. You've got the Westminster government, and now you've got the European government as well. One of the problems for citizens today is that government is actually much more mysterious, and it's a bureaucratic game of a bureaucratic game of mirrors and corridors of power that actually turn out to be dead ends. And I think this is a bad aspect of the way in which government institutions have mutated in recent years. Or the word isn't mutated, is it? It's what does metastasize? Government has metastasized, and this makes it more confusing for people. It makes it more easy for corporations and lobbyists, and it's in general an undesirable thing. And one of the reasons I don't like proportional representation, is because proportional representation creates a class of members of parliament who are not particularly concerned or at all about their members about the constituencies where they live or the people who live there, and are concerned about which position in the party list their leader is going to put them in. So it creates a political, it increases the political class, and I don't like either of those things. So localism, yes, as a way in which we grow up, we learn to love our home, we go back to it, and as you described, and there's another important point there, yes, that's good. But as a way of reconstructing government, it's not necessarily a good thing, and as a way of telling people you want them to eat the food that you grow and nobody else, and not something that is grown 100 miles away, that's a bad thing.
I would like to add that to a French ear, the idea of not knowing aubergines is the symbol of the depth of misery.
We will very soon go to the audience questions, and I will open the floor for that.
I would like to add one or two remarks to the issue of localism in the era of globalization. My suggestion is, as on many matters, to think in terms of multi-level structures. Of course, all politics is local. All people involved in electoral politics know that. And as soon as you can assume responsibility for not a too big territory, you can make sure that good governance is carried out there. If the territory becomes too big, well, you will fail more often than not. So the lowest layer must be the local scenery, there where you feel to be at home, where you can cultivate the feeling of at-homeness. Depending on technological development, on economic exchange, those tiny spots of the world get more and more connected. This is what we see throughout history. Different valleys from the bigger political entity, rivers no longer divided parts of the population. In the 19th century, out of different single states, like in the case of Germany, a unified empire emerged. And then we have the idea to unify Europe along its historically distinct nations, and the utmost vision is the unifying humankind, getting rid of wars, getting rid of injustice. That's basically a good idea, moving up the ladder. The problem is that you impose more and more and heavier burdens, intellectual burdens and emotional burdens on people. Understanding a multi-level system of government is much more difficult than to understand policy making in one's local community. And this is why so many are so desperate about understanding or not understanding or not being willing to understand European policy making. But the additional thing is the emotional layer. If people get told it's illegitimate to be in the first line, Welsh or Scottish or people from southwestern France or being Saxons, Bavarians, whatever else, but at least you have to be a Frenchman or a British or a German. Well, this was the era of nationalism, where the local identities were driven in the background, unsuccessfully, by the way. And then comes the next effort. We need to become Europeans. And in the era of migration, we all have to be humans and only look at the fact that humans come to us. Of course, it's humans. They have equal rights as ourselves. But there are some follow-up problems which we cannot ignore. There are additional emotional, intellectual, and financial burdens. So the issue is to connect the necessary preeminence of localism, patriotism devoted to a very restricted area, over the feeling of being a patriot in a nation state, up to the feeling we're European patriots and patriots on this wonderful and highly vulnerable blue planet. But this cannot be ordered. Now you have to feel like this. This needs to grow. And if there are crises in how to handle the emerging problems, you need to be patient and good-willing, even if you're part of that political elite or that social elite who as a sum of any words really can afford to live globalization, whereas the some words are condemned to live at the spot where they were born, where they know the language, where they have the skills, where they have their whole fate attached to a certain tiny spot of the world. And this is one of our big issues. Our societies are torn between globalized elites and localized somewheres. And this we need to avoid, and we have done everything to make this rift, this divide in our societies bitter and bitterer ever again.
Could I just, I agree with that. And there's another aspect of this, which we've touched on, that we should perhaps pay more attention to. When people were analysing why Trump was elected, why Brexit was passed, why all the things we're discussing have been happening, they concentrated first upon the economic failures and the economic distress of various groups of the population. And there's no doubt that there were good examples of that. But I think increasingly social scientists, and indeed ordinary people and politicians, are reaching the conclusion that that was only a small part of the distresses that were being expressed. Many of the people, if you look at the surveys that were done by various writers, many of the people who were most angry about what they thought had happened to them, about their neglect, about the way they'd been left behind, these objections were cultural. When I was looking at this for this discussion, I came across and I looked at a number of Vox Pop interviews and a number of surveys in which people gave the full answers that ordinary members of the public had given to the surveyors. And the one that struck me was as follows. They said, look, we can't make any impact on the way things are. You know, you used to be able to say what you think in this country, but I don't feel it's my country anymore because I'm not allowed to say any of the things I believe. And once it used to be, this is the funny line, once it used to be that there were certain words you couldn't say. Now you can't express your opinions. And those words are spoken all the time on television. So this was a kind of, a normal person's kind of expression of angst. And I think that is extremely powerful because it's not people who are unemployed or retired and low incomes. It's a huge swathe of the working population. It turns out to be perhaps the majority of the population. The somewheres, I think David estimates that they're 50% of the population, and the anywheres are at 25%, but 25% gravitating in between them. And this is extremely important, and it's the main resistance, in my view, to the ideology of globalism. Because without working out their own counter-ideology, localism or whatever, these people know they don't like what they're getting. And they're not given the words, the arguments, the phrases by the anywheres that would enable them to express clearly what it is they don't like and what it is they want.
And I totally agree, and I'd like to add something again about the way we do politics. Because our politicians believe that victories are won in the center. And Macron's campaign catchphrase was "en même temps I will do this," and "en même temps I will do that." And he's a very special case. He is somebody who came out of the French technocracy, but he was very young. He was 20 years younger than anybody else on the campaign trail. And he said, I want to take the good things from the left and the good things from the right, which is very helpful when you actually do not have a party at all. You're making it up as it goes along. So he was a magpie. He was sort of taking stuff and politics and people, personalities, that they were known as the Macron-compatible personalities. And it was good because he was taking personalities away from other parties at a time when people were tired with those parties. But there's a great danger in that because even though the example everywhere in the world is that the great victories are won by politicians who are actually strong-minded, sometimes even divisive, because at least the voters recognize something instead of this mishmash where I'm not allowed to say anything. And these are seen as transgressive, but I haven't heard in the mainstream discourse, and we in the media are guilty for that as well, that now is the time to find, to listen to politicians who have their own voice instead of having people who say they can at the same time organize everything. This is impossible, and two, it means in a sense that any opinion which is not a sort of strange mix of compromise designed to reach a lukewarm agreement is the only way to go into politics, even though we get the practical proof every year that these are not the people who win elections. And again, this is something that I think is not good for us, because take a country like France, the two parties in the opposition, the Socialist and the Républicain, have been destroyed by this thing. People voted for Macron because they mistook him for a leader who knew what he wanted, because they all hated him. So since I myself is disappointed with the government, whatever government it is, new guy, never seen him before, he annoys them, I'll vote for him. It's a one-shot. It probably will not happen again, and unless he runs against Marine Le Pen again, which is a possibility. But if anybody else from the normal parties runs against him, they have a very clear chance of winning. But that's not good for politics. In politics, you need to have a viable opposition. You may think it's easier not to have a viable opposition, but in the long run, you get a country that does not get a voice at all, and they don't even know that the voice was stolen from them.
Thank you for your comments and contribution. At this point, I suggest to open the floor for the audience questions. Apparently, there's some. So first, I would like to give the mic to the gentleman. My colleagues will help you with the microphone that's due to the voice. Probably it's better if you speak into that.
I just wanted to ask Anne about the idea you had about the kind of core values in France. When was that abolished? Because it sounds like a really, really good idea.
Actually, the French more or less know what the core values are in France, and they were shaped by the history of the country, as indeed, values that people immediately recognize are always shaped by the history. Sometimes centuries of history that people are no longer quite aware with precision. It's a palimpsest of former parties and former existence, but it still is very strong. There's a French political tradition which belongs to Christian democracy in France, even though we haven't had a Christian Democrat party in that name for 50 years. And still, if you go to the provinces, you can see that those people who are elected in the name of newer parties, they belong to a very specific tradition that you can identify. And it's the same thing for the Liberal Democrats and the Whigs in England. It's a party that is spotty, and the new iteration was such a failure because it departed from this sort of a link with this ghost party that no longer existed. But these things are very strong in politics. So French values are shaped by the history of the French Revolution and the 19th century, in which the two camps, the Royalists and the Revolutionaries, basically slugged it out, and it was also the Enlightenment opposed to the French brand of Catholicism, which is pretty specific as well. But at the end of the day, what the French got was the secular theory, la laïcité, which had to do with the idea of having a consensus at the heart of the public space. Lots of people say the French secularism is intolerant, and certainly all sorts of people have said that French secularism is intolerant, both from the left and from the right. And the Muslim Brotherhood thinks that France is incredibly intolerant. But the only way that we can keep this agreement is we say the heart of the Republic is neutral. We don't have an established religion the way England has an established religion, and all religions are protected, but no religion is official, and those religions do not have a voice as religions in the public debate, and they do not have rights in those parts of society that are shaping up society. And for instance, the whole headscarf controversy with the law that was passed under Nicolas Sarkozy, under Nicolas Sarkozy's Home Secretary, under Jacques Chirac as president, was that functionaries of the state could not wear headscarves. People working for any kind of national institution could not wear headscarves because that was ostentatious. Children could not wear headscarves in schools. students who are majors and therefore are allowed to make their own decisions could wear headscarves, and to this day can wear headscarves in universities. But we owe all French children a neutral education so that they can make their choices afterwards. And that's something in which the left and the right are broadly in agreement. The Catholic Church has admitted it. There are various colours in French Islam, and some of them admit it, and some others are still fighting it. It is just one example, but France, essentially, apart from a tiny minority, is now a Republican country. The principles of equality is such that we are now, if you take into account redistribution by benefits, we're the most redistributive country in Europe, more than Sweden. All of this is something that people sign up for. And it could be different for a different country. The idea that taxes could go down, people like it, but you will find more people complaining about lowering the taxes because it means that the rich are not doing, and the well-off are not doing their bit to have equality and fraternity in society. Some of this is policy, some of this are strong values, but you can define them. And the contract that was signed, that people had to sign, was in effect to say, we have equality between men and women, we have neutrality of religion, we have freedom of religion, we protect freedom of religion, we have a system, we have a system of education that's decided by the state with and approved by the state. You cannot have the baccalaureate if you haven't followed a course of studies either on your own or being homeschooled or in a school, but that enables you to pass the baccalaureate. And that's something in which you will not find opposition in the country. That's the basis where I would put it. And again, people would be shocked. And that has changed a bit. People would be shocked if, for instance, there was a chapel at the Élysée and Mass was said at the Élysée.
But they did away with that catalog? Was that just a recent development? Or?
They did away with?
The catalog you had to kind of subscribe to?
The catalog itself there was an element of a gimmick. I mean, it was this little transparent hard plastic bag, and you had a number of documents and bits about French history and all that. And there was a dedicated ministry headed by somebody who subsequently became Home Secretary under Sarkozy. And the ministry had this whole thing organized. But the signing up of the document that says this is what you sign up to in order to get permanent residence in France, that's gone. I don't know how that happened. I suspect when the ministry disappeared, a lot of the provisions that were done specifically by the Ministry for Immigration disappeared as well.
I'll just to add to that briefly, the question of national identity in England. I mean, there's a strong national identity, and traditionally has been, but it's not been much codified. When Orwell tries to write about it, he points out there are two elements which strike him. One is that the British genuinely believe in fairness, and they try to apply fairness to disputes that arise. It's a very vague concept. It's not to be confused with equality, for example, although there's an element of admiring equality about it. So that was one. The other was freedom. And there's no doubt that the British regarded themselves as a free society, a free people, have done so for a long time. And I mean, it used to be the case, probably still is in most parts of the country, that an argument in a pub would end with somebody saying, well, it's a free country. Meaning I can say what I like, and you have to sort of tolerate that fact. I think that is there is a lot of evidence from surveys that feeling is rather now that is under threat. There are too many things you cannot say, and I think that's an important element. A few years ago, because of the uncodified nature of Britishness, the Labour government decided that it would establish a list of British qualities and establish tests for naturalisation that people should be expected to be able to pass. Well, that was a bit like putting vegetarians in charge of a steakhouse. I mean, they had no sympathy with what they were asking, and so they tended to say, what is the rule in the health service? What is the what is the point of the health service? What makes it an important part of English life? Well, it is an important part of English life, as a matter of fact. It is not an important part of Englishness or Britishness. And there are a whole series, except as an expression of fairness, actually. But there are a whole series of questions that bore no relation to the history of Britain, because that was felt it would be embarrassingly divisive, because you now have people who are not from traditional British ethnic groups. So, I mean, I think that these things are best left in the main to social developments, to the natural social changes, and government can't really intervene and ask people this way, but they should when people are becoming British subjects or citizens. They should, in fact, ask them questions like, well, make sure they can speak the language. That's one very obvious test, and I think they should. And if they have any beliefs that are outrageous to British culture, anti-Semitism, it seems to me, is or should be one of those, then I think it's a legitimate thing to say, we have nothing against your general set of beliefs, but we're not going to naturalize you until you have shown evidence that you no longer have a hatred of a substantial element in the British community. I mean, these are common sense things, and I'm not looking so much for people to proclaim beliefs so much as I am for making sure that their beliefs do not outrage what is the normal morality of English society.
Well, my name is Peter Byström. John and Anne, you mentioned Brexit and the win of Donald Trump in the US. Professor Patzelt talked about Germany. We are both from Germany. I'm a member of the parliament, and I'm representing a party which was born just because the political elites didn't care about what the people wanted. And I'm asking you, what are the reasons why are there still, where comes this paternalistic attitude, you know, just trying to tell the people what they should think, even after elections losing, like Angela Merkel is in every election losing some percentage, and there are on the other side examples like Viktor Orban or Kaczynski in Poland. They are winning; they have more than 65%, you know, and they are winning. The Polish, they got 6% more now. So there is a way for success in the elections. They can see it in Central Europe doing the politics for the people, and they are not doing it. So what's the reason? And where comes the support of a big part of the media for this paternalistic, globalistic way of thinking?
Well, I'm not German, and I don't speak.
But it's the same in the US with Hillary Clinton and with this bench, and you have to fight 3 years.
Yes.
Look at Brexit. This was the most democratic thing you can do. Ask the people.
I absolutely see that. And I'm not going to evade the question. What I was just about to say was, I'm not speaking German, and not being German means that I obviously can't give you a considered and precise reply on the situation of the AfD and other parties. And it may be that the discussion will illuminate that. But yes, the reluctance of political elites to pursue policies which are very popular, but which for some reason are difficult for them, or just unappealing to them, is well established. For example, Mrs. Thatcher won 3 elections, 3 elections, and yet there was an immediate attempt when she lost power of the political elites to distance the Conservative Party from her. The rank and file loved her, but the people at the top of the party wanted, on a range of issues, to distance themselves from her. Reagan was followed by a vice president who announced what he stood for when he said in a major speech, "I want a kinder, gentler America," to which Nancy Reagan said immediately, "Kinder and gentler than whom exactly?" And so there is a disposition on the part of elites to protect their valued policy positions that they think are important. Now, that's a general truth, but it becomes a very significant one at the end of the Cold War, because a range of issues and commitments which had not really been at the forefront of people's political mind and the general public were on the forefront of the mind of the political elites. Many of the things the professor said in his description were post-1989 developments, or they accelerated after that. I'm talking about mass immigration. That stepped up, partly because more people wanted to come and were able to afford to come, and partly because, in the case of Britain, Tony Blair actually relaxed the regulations and promoted a much higher level of immigration. Who knows what they thought would happen, but they did think that the opposition of prejudiced opposition would fade away. They didn't really attach, because they thought that we need more workers, we need more skills, and these things will promote greater growth, and greater growth will make these policies acceptable. Well, we got greater growth, but of course there was cultural resistance which grew because people felt that the society was changing in ways that made it foreign to them. Now, some of those objections may have been foolish, but as an overall matter, they weren't foolish. I mean, if you went to parts of England which had been massive immigration. Take, for example, Birmingham. The city of Birmingham has had tremendous scandals because radical Muslims have got control of public schools, and they have introduced curriculums which are offensive to the majority opinion in Britain, and of course annoying particularly to the parents of other children in the school. Now, that's a perfectly legitimate question. But there was enormous opposition on the part of the progressive left, particularly the Guardian newspaper, to admitting that anything like this was happening. Now, I don't see that to say, I don't like my daughter going to a school in which she's separated into a single-sex section, and they're not taught mathematics, or they're not encouraged to go into scientific subjects. I think that's objectionable. And if you object to it, you're not being racist. You're simply wanting a certain kind of life for your daughter. And that's something which the progressive left is oddly, because they should be more concerned about those things than anybody else. But they are, in fact, in all of the countries, unwilling to accept those truths, that news, if it seems to impact on the legitimacy of mass migration. And I think we have to find ways of talking about those questions in ways that are decent and honourable and fact-based and sensible, but which nonetheless raise these questions. Now, as I say, I'm not German, and I don't follow the German debate closely, but I think in all of our countries we're seeing the emergence of political forces which sometimes, I do know something about Sweden, the Swedish Democrats, some parties emerging to fight these things make early mistakes from which it's hard to recover. But increasingly, they are raising these questions in a way that is legitimate and serious. And in the case of Britain, the Brexit Party did so, I thought, with great responsibility in the campaign of the last year.
Thank you very much. My name is David. Although I believe in nation states, I think there are some questions that we have to answer as Europe, especially in regards in China or the United States, because we are hardly able to compete with them economically, and I think that we are absolutely not able to compete with them militarily. Do you think that the joint army of the European Union would be able to preserve us as we are now? Or is it just the idea or the product of the globalist ideology? Thank you very much.
Well, thinking, having the hope, or to put it in more truthful words, the illusion that something like a European army could exist not only on paper but on the battlefield is something I would really try to discourage. Only talking about present times, the German army is not able to bring its helicopters into the air or its submarines down the water, or to have enough tanks for the military obligations the Bundeswehr has accepted in the framework of the NATO. When it comes to what the army should do, in the case of Germany, the German Bundestag has to allow military measures, and the parliament is used to make very strict assignments to the military leaders. Bringing artillery to Afghanistan was a major political effort which was required on part of the parliament. Therefore, if I want to have a European army, design it without the Germans. It won't work with the Germans.
There are two main, there are more armies obviously in Western Europe, and some who fight very expertly and very well, and I've been very impressed by the Italian contribution to the coalition in Iraq, for instance. But there are two armies that have a global reach, and that's the French and the British army. And it's one instance in which the French and the British are, extremely well allied and at good terms, with two treaties formalizing the French-British cooperation in all matters strategic and military and security. The Traité de Saint-Malo, the Saint-Malo Treaty, and the Lancaster House Further Treaty. And each nation can deploy a comparable, and has deployed worldwide, a comparable number of troops, which vary depending on time between 15,000 and 20,000. And they cleverly have divided, I won't say that they have divided the globe like, old colonial powers, but basically they have expertise in different places and even in different forces. The British Navy has got a great deal of expertise, and the French Navy is peripheral enough, let's say, to the military service in general, that it can get away with, to this day, it still calls itself nicknamed La Royale. Well, that's not the senior service in a country that's so fiercely Republican as France, but the French are holding sub-Saharan Africa together right now. If we left, and if the few people who come and help us sort of stop doing that, in a sense, you would have meltdown for 4 or 5 countries, including Chad, Mali, south, the south of Algiers, etc. And there's a kind of hollow that has been sort of political and military hollow that was created in sub-Saharan Africa even before the disaster of the French, British, and American campaign in Libya, which develops and metastasizes. It's a very good word. In terms of sort of Islamic terrorism and taking over entire nations. So you've got deployment in the Indian Ocean by the British Navy, which are quite remarkable. You've got a number of other things that happen on the spot, ad hoc, and these work. But I think, even if you ally together the French and the British Army, they can do one campaign, but they haven't got what the requirement that is in I think the strategizing rules for the US Army, which is to be able to pursue 2 major conflicts simultaneously on 2 different parts of the globe. I don't think we can do that.
I think the answer is very clear here, and chimes in with what both my fellow panelists have said. There is a very successful military alliance that defends Europe. It's NATO. It defends Europe persuasively, so to speak. People think it can provide serious defense. Whether it would in every circumstance is another matter. They know, however, as a general truth, NATO can defend Europe. They know that because the United States is the member of NATO. And NATO is the mechanism which keeps the United States as a European power. America, the United States, is as much a European power, in fact more of a European power, than any of the existing European powers. And as long as that is the case, there can be peace in Europe. There can be peace against external attacks from, obviously, we think of Russia in these circumstances, and we also think, I suppose, in terrorist sense of jihadist revolutionaries. But it also, America, by its presence, maintained a European peace internally, because from 1949 onwards, every European country knew the Americans would not tolerate a major conflict between two of the powers. And since they wouldn't tolerate it, it wasn't going to happen. So this is the truth of European peace. We need the Americans, and therefore we should do the one thing that they ask of us, really, which is to provide more money for our own defense in NATO. I don't like the idea of a European defense organization because I think that diverts or duplicates expenditure that should go to NATO.
We have time for one last and short question. So, please, Professor.
Odhiambo Moses, professor from Kenya. My question is, we have got globalism. How can we modulate globalism in such a way that we have got environmental free world? For example, viruses, like in China now, we have got the coronavirus, which is very lethal, and it is only through globalism that we can fight such like cybersecurity or whatever comes in what I will term like smart security technology.
I would respond as follows. We're sometimes, when in fact on this panel we've been asked to look at, so to speak, the conflict, the tension between nationalism and globalism. I would set you out the following triad. There are three things. There's nationalism, there's supranationalism, and there's internationalism. Nationalism and internationalism go together. Internationalism depicts the agreements among states to achieve common objectives. Supranationalism suggests a new structure of international relations in which states are replaced, as professors already outlined clearly, states are replaced by new institutions that absorb their powers, so to say, sucking them upwards to a higher level. Both of those, both supranationalism and international nationalism, can sometimes produce collective organizations which do good, WTO and similar things. But in fact, the natural organization, the natural arrangement is one in which internationalism brings together nation states to achieve common objectives. You don't need this additional level, and on a lot of subjects, of course, it's not doing good, it's doing harm. Whereas, generally speaking, when democratic governments, particularly democratic governments, come together for common objectives, they aim sensibly at the right objectives, and they're restrained or supported in achieving those objectives by their own peoples in the nature of democratic government. So I think you're right that there are sometimes common problems which need greater than national effort, but that can be achieved by cooperation between nation states.
Call it the coalition of the willing.
Thank you very much for the informative conversation, and thank you for the questions. Our next event will take place on the 19th of February. Save the date. Further information will come soon. Please subscribe to our mailing list, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or just visit our website. If you have any interpreter devices with you, please return them at the exit and drop your feedback forms filled in the box also at the exit. Stay tuned and have a nice evening.